Welcome to the third video in the Python Bootcamp series. I'm Adam with Push the Envelope, the channel that gives you everything artificial intelligence and machine learning. This episode, we're going to be looking at what are for loops and how can we use them. Now, for loops are, again, one of the more fundamental things of any programming language, and it's really what sets a programming language apart from just a typical calculator you may see on your computer. For loops let you execute code repeatably and allow you to do a lot of things simultaneously in some very complex logic over and over again. So without further ado, let's jump over to the notebook and we will start looking at how do we use for loops. For those who have not been following along from the beginning, we are over in the Jupyter notebook, and at the very top I do have my GitHub link. There you can find all the templates that I'm using for this tutorial, along with the solutions as well. I highly recommend you go back and check out the first two videos on variables and if statements. It's going to be very important to understand those as we begin to work through this notebook and some of the exercises. But for now, let's go ahead and get started. As you can see, we are looking at three different sections here. One for the for loop, one for the while loop, and then one for a more advanced looping of combining all this together. So let's go ahead and start with the for loop. Now, for loop is meant for executing the code in a deterministic way, which means you're going to execute the for loop for as many iterations as you tell it to, whether that's to the end of a list or a set number of times to loop through it. You are going to run the code. So the very first thing, probably the easiest, is to just work through a list and print out or do some sort of code to a list element by element. So if we're looking at the very first list here, we have for x in, and then we have our list. So our list is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Make sure you end that with a colon. And then just like the if statements, anything that you want to execute within the for loop needs to be indented from the beginning of the for statement. So in this case, we're just going to print out everything within the list that we passed it. What this logic up top is saying is for every element, we're going to store each element as x, and then we're going to do something with that element. So it's going to go work through 0 first. 0 is going to be equal to x, and then we're just going to print out x to the screen, and we're going to work through 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if we print, you can see we have printed 1, 2, 3, and 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 to the screen. So that's the way you can do it, by defining a list right in the for loop. You can also just do it as a separate variable. So now if I have my list and I save it separately, maybe 1, 2, 3, and 4 again. Now I do a for loop, so for x in my list this time, because the list is already the array. Now I'm just, again, going to print out x. One thing you can do just to keep these separately is, in order to print a new line, it is a \n with quotes around it. And this is just going to separate the two outputs so we can really see what each are printing. But as you can see, either having the list in the for loop or a list as a variable will let you work through it and then print that out to the screen. Okay, so not only can you print things to the screen, but you can also, if you wanted to, you could say, I want to print x plus 1. So now, instead of just printing the thing, we are going to add 1 to it and then print it to the screen. So each value is being increased by 1. So you can do a whole bunch of complex logic, and it doesn't just have to be one statement. I could also say done after each, or something along the lines of that. So you can work some pretty complex stuff in here, and we'll get to that. So I'm going to pause here for a quick exercise. Basically what I want you to do is using the for loop that we just talked about, start with this list. So this list is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and all I want you to do is go element by element and print out to the screen what that value is squared, so to the power of 2. So go ahead, take a second, and then come back when you have an answer to compare it to what I do. Okay, so working through this, I'm going to say for x in my list, print x to the power of 2. Remember, to the power of is a double star. And if we print that out, you can see each value is squared. Okay. Now, coming back down here, we're going to be calculating, again, another exercise, calculating the gratuity for a bill. So you have this list of bills, and there's a whole bunch of floating points. And we're going to copy that down here. And now what you're going to do, just use a for loop again, loop through each one of these bills, and print out how much of a tip should I leave if I'm trying to leave 18%. So go ahead, try to do that. It's almost identical to what we did before, except you're not using exponents. So take some time and come back. Okay, so I'm going to loop through this. One thing that I haven't showed yet is when I've been declaring our for loops, like up here, I've said for x in my list. X is just something I randomly made up. It does not matter what the value is. You can save it to any variable name. So I'm going to say for bill in bills, just to make it a little simpler, make it a little easier to read. So for bill in bills, I'm going to print the bill times 0.18, and that it will be our 18% tip. And as you can see, this all prints out to the screen. Now, I've hinted at this before, but obviously when we're talking about cents, we don't need all of these extra decimal places at the end. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to save a new variable called tip in here, and that's going to be equal to bill times 0.18. And now when I print it out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the round function. I'm going to round the tip, and the second argument is going to be, so comma, however many decimal places you want. And in this case, I'm going to want 2 decimal places. So now when we print it out, you can see at most 2 are printed out. Okay. So I'm hoping you were able to get both of those exercises. If not, again, keep working through it, but we're going to be using loops a lot in this. And this is one of the tutorials that I have that has a ton of exercises, because it's really about repetition and really understanding how to use the loops, because you're going to be using this probably the most out of anything. So don't worry, we're going to have plenty of opportunities to test this out. Okay, so not only can you loop through the list, but you can also loop through an index. So you can reference the list by index. And this may not be readily apparent why we would want to do this, but don't worry, we're going to go over exactly why we would want to later. But basically, if I have my list, let's say my list has 0, let me make sure it's equal to, my list is equal to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, we just leave it at that, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. What I'm going to say is for x in range 5. All right, so what is range? Range is saying I want a range of numbers, range of 5 numbers, and it's going to start at 0 if you don't declare anything. So this is going to give us 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Maybe I should change the list just so you can see what I mean by this. So I'm going to change the list to 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 instead. Okay, so for x in range 5, let me just print x to show you what this is. It's going to start at 0, like I said, and it's going to go 5 numbers, which is really going to be 4. If you remember indexing, this is kind of exactly what we need, is 0 to 4 will give us the index of each one of these. So if I print that out, you can see what the index is. Maybe just to show you, I'm going to do a comma. I'm going to say my list at that index, and that index is going to be x. So now you could see the for loop is giving us the index, and the second part of it is giving us the actual value at that index within the list. Hopefully you remember indexing from the list tutorials. If not, go ahead and go back and check those out, because they're super important for this. Okay, so in this sense, we were able to say for x in range 5, which gives us 0 to 4. Now I could specify that I only want 3 to 5. Now 3 to 5 is going to, if we run this, show you what it does. It's going to give us 3, 4, but it's not going to include the last value. So it's going to stop 1 short. So just also keep that in mind. But it's a way to, if you don't want to print the first 3 elements of the list, you can start at 3 and work your way up. Okay. Another way of doing this for x in range, I'm going to say the length, len, will give us a length of a list. So my list. What this is saying is instead of up here, if I were to remove this 3 again, instead of me telling the for loop how many elements specifically are on the list, I'm going to let the for loop figure out how many elements there are and print all of them. So now if I print x and I print my list at x, now we can see, again, I'm going to print a space just to clean up our output a little bit, and that is \n. But now we can see it's going to print the same exact thing, except for this list down here is going to be dynamic, and so it's going to look for the length of the list. So this for loop is going to look for the length of the list. If I were to add, let's say, a value of 6 to the list, the first one is only going to execute 5 times. It is not going to grab that last value because I didn't tell it that the list is now 6. So that's really the power of using range length of the list. Because down here, obviously, you can see it did print that last one. Okay. So now I want you to do exactly what we did before. So we have this list. I want you to print the squared value, but I want you to use the index instead of looping through the list. So like we did up here, where you're using the range, go ahead and work through the list and print out the squared values using the index. Okay, so let's work through this. So for x in range, length of my list. Now you could say the list is only 5 and pass that directly into range, but you really should get used to using the range, the length of the list, just to make sure your code doesn't run into any errors, make sure you're not missing any values. So now I'm going to print my list at x. That's going to give me the value of the list, and I'm just going to square that value. If we print that out, you can see those are the same values as we had before. They're all the squared values. Hopefully, I know this is probably the most complex thing we've gotten to at this point. So again, don't worry. We're going through a ton of exercises right now to really hammer this home because this is super important to do it this way. Okay. Again, we're going to go the same exercise we did before, calculating the gratuity. We have all of these bills. We're going to copy this down. Go index by index and calculate the bill based on the index of the list. So go ahead and write that for loop. Okay, let's go ahead and say for x in range, bills, length of bills. We are going to print. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to save it as a new one again. So I'm going to say the tip is equal to the bills at x times 0.18. I didn't stress it enough on the last one, but it's super important that when you're referencing the thing in the list, you need to make sure you are passing in that index. If you don't, you're going to try to multiply the entire list by 0.18, and you're going to get an error, or you're going to accidentally get values that you weren't anticipating. So make sure you are using the index on the list when you go to calculate it. But then I'm going to print, and I'm going to use the round function again. I'm going to round the tip to 2 decimal places. Print that out, and you can see those are all of our tips. Okay, let's go down here. And this is really going to give you a sense of why indexing is the way to go for loops if you have multiple lists. So here's what I want you to try to do, and then I'm going to show you how to do it. I want you to try to take both of these lists. So I'm going to copy these down here. So I have first names and last names. I want you to use a for loop, and I want you to print the person's first name and the last name within every cycle of the for loop. So think of how you may be able to do that. I'll give you the hint that you really need to use indexing for this, but go ahead, take some time, try to see what you can come up with for this, and I'll come back and show you how to do it. Okay. All right, so let me show you um, why it's important to use indexing for this. So for x in range, length of, you can pick either one. Since they're the same, it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to say the length of first names. Okay. I'm going to print the first names. Make sure you index it. This is going to give me the very first name. Now, the reason I want to use the index is because I can use that same index to grab the first last name. So now I can say last names at X. When I print this out, you can see it goes line by line through each list at the same time and grabs the first names and the last names, working the way down. Hopefully that makes it a little more clear why we want to do it this way, because again, it's super important. You're going to be using this a lot. So with that, let's go ahead and try that again. So we're going to do a different one here. So we have two lists, list 1 and list 2. I'll copy these down here. All I want you to do, same thing we did before, but I want you to add the value in list 1 to the value of list 2. So 1 plus 2, 2 plus 4, 3 plus 6, and so on. So write a for loop to go one by one through the lists and add the two values together and print that to the screen. Okay, so for x in range, and I like to use for x in range, again, x, it does not matter. You can say it's I, you can say it's something, you can put whatever you want. I get used to using x. Just make sure you're not using something that already has a value associated with it. So for x in range, length of list 1, what are we doing? We are going to print list 1 at x plus list 2 at x. It's going to grab the indexed value of list 1, and then same for list 2. It's going to go one by one through the list. Print those out, and you can see we get the values of the two added together. Okay, getting a little more complex here. Another exercise, we're going to calculate the stock value. So I want you, for every stock, so here's all of our stocks: Apple, Tesla, Google, Meta, and Amazon. We have the price associated with them. And we have how many shares that this person has. So what I want you to do is I want you to create a for loop with all of these. So copy these down. Create a for loop to print out the name of the stock and print out the total price. And the total price is going to be calculated by taking the price times the number of shares that you have. So see what you can do on that, and then come back and compare your answers with mine. Okay. For x in range, length of stocks, what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to calculate the total first. I'm going to say the total is equal to prices at x times shares at x. You could do this in the print statement. I'm just trying to clean it up a little bit. But what am I going to do? I'm going to print stocks at x, then I'm going to print the total price. I'm also going to round the total because, again, this is dollar figures. So I'm going to round the total to 2 decimal places. And that should be it. So when we print this out, you can see we have $256.22 in Apple stock, and all the rest of them are down here as well. So again, this is really why indexing is super important for for loops, because you're going to need to reference multiple lists at the same time. If you don't, then that's fine. You can do for x in range stocks if you only need to print the stock name. But when you have multiple lists that you're trying to use, you're going to really need to use indexing. Okay, the last one. Okay, so we're going to use exactly what we did before, but here's what I want you to do. Instead of printing each individual total, I want you to come up with a running total. So I want to know how much money I have total in my account over all stocks. So use those same lists that we have right here. Run through, and you got to come up with a running total. I won't give you a hint yet. See what you can come up with. See what ways you think you're able to do it, and then come back and I will show you the way to do it. Okay, so we can go ahead and make a for loop for x in range, length of stocks. Okay, what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to calculate the total. So I want to know the total for Apple, total for Tesla, Google, Meta, all those. So I'm going to say the total, the same thing we did before. It's going to be the prices at X times the shares at X. Okay, so that's going to give me the individual total price, but that really isn't what I'm looking for. I'm looking for my total account. So I need a value outside of the for loop to be able to keep track of what my total account balance is. So if I make something called account, and I'm going to start it at $0, and every time I calculate the total, I'm going to update the account by adding it to it. So I'm going to say account equals account plus the total. That way, every time I run through this, it's going to update the account with the new total, adding it to it and giving me a grand total at the very end. Now, when I'm outside of the for loop, and again, make sure you indent here because I want to print at the very end what my account is. So if I print it, you can see here's what my total account is. Now, I want to show you if you didn't do that. Let's say I kept my print indented within the for loop. Now, every single time it goes through, it's going to print the account. So you can see a accumulated sum as you go down it, but we really just want the final value. Okay, so that's great. I'm hoping those exercises helped you out, helped you get a better idea of how to use for loops. Again, don't worry about it because we're going to have a ton more exercises. One of the other benefits of doing it this way is now I can create a new list based on something else. So if you remember back at our list tutorial, we had the append function in order to add a new value to a list. Okay, so maybe I just want to create a new list. So what I want to do is I want to define a blank list first. So if I print this list to the screen, you can see my list is empty. Okay, so now maybe I do a for loop. So for x in range, and I'm just going to say 5. And I want to add those values, so it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. I want to add those to the list. So my list dot append x. So this is going to work through the for loop one by one, adding those values of x to the list. And now if we print my list at the very end, you can see it has added those values one by one to the list. If I push this print over to be within the for loop, you can see it's slowly being built up till the very end where we're done with the for loop and we've added all the values into it. Okay. So using that and what we did before, remember we had all these first and last names. I want you to take these first and last names, and I want you to make a new list of the combined names. So use a for loop, go through, add the first name and the last name together, and save it as a new list with the complete names. All right, hoping you were able to figure that out, but if not, no worries. We're going to run through this right now. I'm going to make a new list called complete names. And again, initialize the list to a blank list so that you can add new things to it. Now I'm going to say for x in range, length of first names. Okay, what are we going to do with this? Well, we're going to add the first name and the last name. So I'm going to say, I'm going to make a new value called name, and I'm going to say name is equal to first names at x plus last names at x. Now I need to add those values to the list. So complete names dot append name. This is going to add this variable that we're creating to the list one by one. Now if I print complete names, you can see here's all of our names. Now, what is missing here? Well, we didn't add a space in between the two. When you do your string math, it doesn't automatically add a space. So in order to add a space, we need to actually add a space character in between the two. Now when we run it, you can see each one is now saved with a space in between, but a full name. Okay, so that's one way you can do math within here, especially with strings, but you can also do it with regular numbers as well. So again, remember back to calculating our gratuity. Now we have a bunch of bills and we have a bunch of tips. So what we want to do is we want to add the tip to the bill and come up with the total cost of the meal. So save all of those costs into a new list. Go ahead, copy these lists down, take a second, try to see what you can come up with, and then come back and compare your answers with mine. Okay, again, we're going to create an empty list to store all of these. So I'm going to call this totals. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to say for x in range length of bills. What am I doing? Well, I'm going to calculate the total to be bills at x plus the tips at x. And then I need to append the total to the new list. So calculating bills plus tips, adding that to the new list as a new value. And then we can print out totals at the very end to see what they were. If you want, when you append these, you can do a round. So I'm going to round the total to 2 decimal places. And I did get an error. It's round singular. There we go. Okay, as you can see, we're down to 2 decimal places now. So ways of working through lists. Okay, getting a little more complex here before we move on from for loops. I have 4 lists now, one for each judge. So copy that down here. What I want you to do is each one of these values within the list corresponds to some competitor. And I want to know what the average score was across each of the judges. So for this first column, it's going to be the average of 3, 4, 5, and 4. I want to know what the average score was. Moving on to the second competitor, third competitor, fourth competitor, whatever. And then I want you to create a new list with the final scores for each person. So see what you can do. Use what we've been doing this entire time and try to come up with something. Okay. Working through this list, we're going to say for x in range, length of judge 1. Again, I'm just using judge 1 because it's the first one. You could use any of these since they're all the same length. But we're going to say the score is equal to do average, we're going to add all of them together and divide by the number of judges. So we're going to say judge 1 at x plus judge 2 at x plus judge 3 at x, and finally judge 4 at x. Notice I put these all in parentheses because I'm about to divide all of that by 4 since there are 4 judges. Before the for loop, I need to add a new empty list. So I'm going to call this scores. And I'm going to append the score that we calculated to the scores. So again, calculating the average across each judge, across all the judges, and then saving that as the value score and adding score to the scores list, scores plural, in order to come up with our averages. And I'm going to print scores, and we can see what the average score was with the third competitor, obviously with the highest score. All right. we are going to take a pause there from for loops, and we're going to move on to using while loops. It's another way of looping in Python. It's I would say it's probably less common than for loops, but there are use cases for using a while loop instead. So let's start looking at that. So the biggest benefit of while loops are they can run forever. However, you can make it run a discrete amount of times like a for loop. So I can't tell it to run 10 times or however many. It just takes a little more work to do that. So the point of a while loop is it looks for a condition to be met before it stops. So it can run forever. You can get cases where you accidentally have an infinite loop because you messed up your indexing. So one thing that you do need to be careful of. But I can say I need to define an index to begin with. So I need to say I is equal to 0. It doesn't have to be 0. It could be some other value, and we'll go over that next. But typically you want to start with 0 or something like that. Now I'm going to say while I is less than 10. So it's going to go until I is equal to or greater than 10. I'm going to print I. But now this is the very important step, and that is if I run this right now, it will go on forever because I will always be 0 and 0 will always be less than 10, and it will never not be less than 10. So this will give me an infinite loop, and I'll have to stop running my code. So it's very important that you update the value of I. So I want to say I is equal to I plus 1. Or plus however many you want to increment it by. I'm just going to increment it one by one for this, just so you can see what is printed out. But as you can see, it runs 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then 10 would be the last value, but it gets up here, and 10 is not less than 10. So it stops running the code, and it moves on to whatever's below the while loop. Now you could run it the opposite way. So let's say I'm actually just going to redo this one. So now I'm going to say I is going to start at 10, and I want to change it for where I is greater than or equal to 0. I'm going to print I out, but I have to be careful because I am incrementing I by 1. So this is going to run through, it's going to be 10. 10 is greater than 0. It's going to run through again, it's going to be 11. 11 is greater than 0. So it's just going to keep going up, and again, another infinite loop. So what I want to do is change this to be subtraction. So now I'm subtracting 1, decrementing 1 every time I run through the while loop. And you can see now we're going from 10 down to 0. One other thing, just for shorthand, you can change this, so either the increment or decrement, to be I minus equals 1. So this is going to subtract 1 from I and save it as I. You can do the same thing with plus, so I plus equals 1. You could say minus equals 3, and it's just going to decrease by 3 every time. You can do a whole bunch of stuff like that. Like if I run this, you can see it's decreasing by 3 until it's below 0 and it stops. Okay. So I want you to take this list right here. So my list. I'm going to push this down here. And I want you to print this out. Print the entire list out using a while loop, not a for loop, a while loop. So see what you can do there, and then come back and I'll show you how we can actually do this. Okay, so coming to this list, we are going to say I is equal to 0. Now, what do we put for our condition in the while loop? Well, I want to know when the I is greater than the length of the list, because if it's greater than the length of the list, then we don't have any more values. So I want to know, I want to only print when it's less than the length of the list. So I'm going to say while I is less than the length of the list. What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to print the position of my list. So my list at the index. The index is going to be I. And now remember, the most important step is we need to increment the I. So I plus equals 1. Or you can say I equals I plus 1. Either way. But this is going to do is it's going to work through one by one. When it gets to the value of, in this case, it will be 5, not the actual value of 5 in the list, but the 5 as the index. So I of 5. It is no longer going to pass this test, and it will stop. And so that's one way you can print out an entire list using a while loop. Typically, you would do this with a for loop, but there are reasons why you would want to do this with a while loop. So moving on, we're going to do the same thing we did up here, right? We're printing the list one by one, but I want you to do it in reverse. So I want you to print it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 instead. See what you can do with that. This is a little harder, but it's definitely very close to what we did before. And then we'll come back and I'll show you how to actually do this. Okay, so if I take this list, what do I want to do? Well, I want to start at the end of the list and work my way backwards. So I'm going to be decrementing the counter. I'm going to be subtracting 1 as we work through, but I need the I to be at the very end of the list. So my I is going to be the length of the list. Now, the one problem with this, the length of the list is 5. But if you remember, indexing starts at 0. There is no 5th index of this list. It's out here. It doesn't exist. This ends at 4. So it needs to be 1 subtracted from the length of the list. That's going to put us at the very last index. So now I want to say while I is greater than or equal to 0. So again, 0 is going to get us the very last or very first number. We don't want it to be less than 0 because it would be negative, and it'll start looking at the end of the list instead of at the beginning. So while I is greater than or equal to 0, I want to print my list at I. And again, the most important step is increment your counter. So in this case, since we're going backwards, we need to decrement the counter. So minus equals 1 or I equals I minus 1, either one. But this is going to print the list in reverse. So here we go, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So that's just a way to print a discrete number of cycles through a list or through whatever you're trying to do. But let's look at some other things of where while loops actually will benefit you the most. So instead of looking at your position within the list, you can look at some other condition. So maybe I have a value that starts with, maybe my value starts at 10. Okay, so I have this value, and I want to know while value is less than 10,000. I want to update the value. So while the value is below 10,000, I want to do something to it. So I want to say value is equal to the value to the power of 2. So I'm just going to keep having the value go to the power of 2. Check to see if it's greater than 10,000. If it's not, take that value, put it to the power of 2, and then keep working through that until it is. What I'm going to do is I will print out every single time it goes through. And if I go ahead and run this. Now, notice I don't have to increment or decrement because my condition is based on the value, and I am updating the value. And so I don't need to have an I don't need to have something else to track the value as I go through it. But as you can see, it started with 10. 10 to the power of 2 is 100. 100 is still less than 10,000. It moved on, did it again, and it got us to 10,000, and 10,000 is not less than 10,000, so it stopped there. Something else, maybe if you have an ATM and you're trying to withdraw money, you might have an account. So maybe I have an account that has $1,000 in it. Or maybe I have an account that has, I don't know, $5,000 in it. Now I'm going to say while my account still has money in it, so still has more than $0 in it, I want to take money out of it. So I'm going to say account minus equals 1,000. this is going to take $1,000 out of my account, assuming I still have money in it. And I will print my account to the screen every single time I do this. I'm also going to print a divider so we can separate the two outputs. Okay, as you can see, we started with 5,000. 5,000 is greater than 0, so we took out 1,000. We're down to 4,000. Took out 1,000, down 3, 2, 1, 0. Now, we don't have any more money left, and so we were not able to continue down into the negative numbers. So just a quick example of how you might do this. Along that lines, we're going to move into an exercise that basically does exactly what we just did, except for in the opposite direction. So let's pretend I'm trying to save up for a vacation, and I really need $1,000 to go on this vacation. And so every month, I'm going to deposit $10 into an account. And I want to stop depositing once I hit that $1,000, and I'm going to go take my vacation. So try to make a while loop that every single time it goes through, your account starts at 0. So let me just start it right now. Account is equal to 0. Make a while loop that adds $10 to your account and stops when you finally reach $1,000 or more, I suppose. So try to do that and come back. All right, so I'm going to make a while loop that says while the account is less than $1,000, I haven't reached my goal yet. So I want to say I'm going to add $10 into it. Now if I print account, we can see each step that it goes through. Go ahead and run this. You can see it's going, lots of outputs, and finally gets to 1,000. But what I could really do is say at the end of the while loop, I'm going to get rid of the space because I want it to not be a part of the while loop. I want it to be outside of it. But I can say time for a vacation. Just have it run, and then when it's finally more than 1,000, equal to or more than $1,000, it's gonna say, "Hey, time for you to take a vacation." So again, one way you can use an account is just track some condition, see if it's met, and then let you know when it is. Okay. Another one we can do is we're going to find Waldo in this list of people. So I want you to go one by one through the crowd and see if you can find Waldo. Whenever you find him, stop and let the person know, hey, we found Waldo. So take this crowd list, make a while loop that will go one by one and see if the person is Waldo or not. Okay. To start this, we're going to actually create our index variable because we're going to go one by one through the list. So we're going to start at 0 and work our way to the end. We could work our way to the end and go to the front, but we're just going to keep it simple for this one. Okay, if you remember, in order to, so the whole point of this is we want to see if the name is equal to Waldo. So I want to say while crowd at I in this case, starting off at 0, is going to grab the name Tom. So I want to compare the name to Waldo. So I want it to keep going when the name is not Waldo. So crowd is not equal to Waldo. Now make sure you don't put while the crowd is equal to Waldo, because the very first time it goes through, Tom is, it will say, is Tom equal to Waldo? It's not, so it's going to stop working. So we want it to be kind of the opposite of what you're thinking. But while the name is not Waldo, we're going to just keep moving through the crowd. So we're going to increment our counter. At the very end, we're going to say, found him. Once we work through the name and we get to Waldo, Waldo does not equal Waldo will be false. So this while loop will stop and we're going to say, hey, we found him. And as you can see, that's what we were able to output to the screen. Okay, so those are the two loops within Python. And now it's really just a combination of how do we use those loops together or along with if statements or a whole bunch of other different things that we can do with them. So Let's start checking out some advanced looping techniques. Right, so we can run loops within loops. So if I want a combination of things, I can print every year and every month combination, something like that. So for instance, if I have years is equal to, let's say 2019, if I can, 2019, 2020, and 2021. Okay, those are our 3 years. Months, I'm not going to do every month, but I'll do January, March, and October. Okay, so I have a list of years and a list of months. Now I can print every combination of that. So I can say for year in years. I can do it immediately followed by another loop. Make sure it's inside of the original for loop. But for month in months, now I can say print month year. All right, before I run this code, let me explain what it's going to do. It's going to start with the years. First year is going to be 2019. And then within 2019, it's going to go through each month. So it's going to grab January. Now it's not going to move to the very end to update the year until it goes through every single month. So the year will be 2019. It'll go through January. Then it'll update the month to March. But the year is still 2019 until it moves through every month. So if I run this, you can see January, March, October for 2019, January, March, October for 2020, January, March, October 2021. So the inner loop is going to go, once it finishes, it's going to update the outer loop, and it's going to just keep doing that. Okay. Sort of along the lines of the ATM, we can also have an account that has $1,000 in it, and maybe we have some withdrawals that we're going to make. So our withdrawals are going to be 50, 50, and 100. Okay, so I want to make sure that my account has money in it, so more than $0 in it. So while the account is greater than 0, if the account has money in it, I'm going to make these 3 withdrawals every single time. So now I'm going to say for withdraw in withdrawals, I'm going to take the account and I'm going to subtract, so minus equals withdraws at, minus equals withdrawal. Okay. So again, every single time, all right, this is going to go until I don't have any more money, but I'm going to make these withdrawals right here. So I'm going to take $50, $50, $100 every single time, update my account. If my account has money in it, I'm going to make those 3 withdrawals again, update my account, make those 3 withdrawals again until I don't have money anymore. I'm just going to print a status of my account outside of this for loop, but still within the while loop so we can see as it goes. But you can see, started with 1,000, took that money out, took the money out, took the money out until we no longer had any more money left in our account. This is just to highlight that you can have for loops inside of while loops and while loops inside of for loops. You can combine the two, but you can really get into some complex stuff. Okay, so using these lists of names, I want you to create a random name generator. So we have a bunch of first names and we have a bunch of last names. Now the first names are not associated with the last name. So Tom Michaels is not necessarily the person. What I want you to do is I want you to come up with every single combination of first names and last names. So using looping within loops, come up with a way to take the first names and take the last names and print every single combination of these 2 lists. Okay, so we're going to use a nested for loop. So we're going to say for first in first names, immediately followed by for last in last names. We're going to print first, last. What this is going to do is it's going to grab Tom as the first name. Then it's going to run through every single last name. So it's going to go Tom Michaels, Tom Peters, Tom Blake, Tom Jones, Tom Williams, and then it's going to update the first name. So now it will be Phil. And now Phil will run through all the last names. And then Tyson, then Karen, then Sue. So you're going to be able to see all of these combinations come together into this long list. And that will give us a random name generator. All right. Not only can you do loops within loops, but you can do if statements within loops. So not only are you going to loop through a list or loop through a range of numbers, but you're going to test those numbers to see different conditions about them. So for instance, in this first one, I want to go through a range of numbers and I want to print whether or not the number is even. If you remember, very first episode, we talked about modulo, which is this operator right here. And modulo 2 will tell us whether or not the number is even. And so if I have 4x in range 10, remember, range 10 will give us 0 through 9. I want to say if x mod 2, remember, modulo will give us the remainder. If it's even, there will not be a remainder. If it's odd, there will be. So I'm going to say if the remainder is equal to 0, I'm going to print it is an even number. I'm also going to print the value of x just so we can see what the value actually was. If it's not even, then it's going to be odd. So I'm going to print x, and then I'm going to print odd. We run this. 0 is even, 1 is odd, 2 is even. You can see it just repeats back and forth until the very end of that range. Okay, if you remember back to the Where's Waldo thing, if I come back up to the top, right here under the exercise Find Waldo, I'm actually just going to grab this list and come back down here. So now I have this list of people in the crowd, and now I want to say if the person is Waldo, say him. If not, then I say not him. So I'm going to say for person in crowd, I'm going to check if the person's name equals Waldo. And I'm going to print out him if the person's name is Waldo. If it's not equal to Waldo, so that's my else statement, I'm going to print out not him. And as we can see, it's going to go person by person through the crowd, compare the person's name to Waldo. If it is Waldo, going to tell us that we found him. If not, we say we did not find him. But as you can see, it's going down until it finally hits the name Waldo and changes the output. Okay. So a couple exercises to end this off. We're going to be using if statements within our loops. So back to our gratuity calculator. Maybe we have a more complex calculator that takes our bill and takes the level of service that we've got in order to figure out what the total tip should be. So I want you to take these two lists right here, service and bills. I want you to make a loop that goes through each bill and compare what the service level was to the amount of tip we should leave. And up here is your little key of if the tip was good, then we're going to leave 18%. If it was bad, 10%, and whatever else it may be. So go through each bill and each level of service and say, print out what my tip amount should be. Okay. So we're going to say for X in range, length of bills. Remember, since we're referencing multiple lists here, we need to do this X in range thing in order to get the index of the list. Because it's very important because we want to compare the values at the same index. So for X in range, length of bills, now I got to compare the service level. So if service equals, remember we're doing a comparison, so that's double equals. If the service equals bad, we are going to say our tip is equal to bills at X times the 10%, which is 0.1. Okay, so that covers the bad. If you remember back to ifs, we have elif to compare our next statement. So now I want to know, oh, and I also just realized this is something you need to pay attention to. I have service. This is going to compare the entire array to bad. But what I really want is the indexed value. So I want the service at X. Same thing with the bills at X. So if the service at X is equal to okay, my tip is going to be bills at the index times 0.15. If I copy this entire elif, I'm going to keep running down here. So I'm going to do the next one. Instead of okay, it's going to be good. And our tip is going to be 18%. And our last one is going to be great. And it's going to be 22%. Now, I don't need to do one, but I could also do an else. And maybe my else is just going to default to 18%, which is right here, which is the good service level. Okay, and then all I'm going to do is print tip. Go ahead and run that. And you can see our tip is printed to the screen. If you want to make it prettier, you can round it. And it will round that off 2 cents for us. But making your for loops a lot more complex using if statements, using more logic within inside of it. So let's go ahead and keep this going. A little more complex here. So now we're going to try to detect fraud in a whole bunch of purchases. So we have a whole bunch of purchases, and we have whether or not the amount or the purchase was expected. And so I want you to work through purchases and expected. Copy these down here. And I want you to let the person know whether or not it's potential fraud. And you're going to do this by saying anything that is over $5,000 and was not expected. So those two conditions, over $5,000, was not expected. Those are going to be your potential fraud. Everything else, you're just going to label as not fraud. So try to make a loop, go through this, and we'll come back and see how to do it. Okay. Again, we have two lists here. We're going to need to index the list. So for x in range, length of purchases. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to compare the purchase price. So if purchases at X, so remember to make sure you use that index. So the very first purchase, we're going to see, is that purchase price over $5,000? Along with that, I also need to see, so and, because I need both statements to be true. I need to see if expected at X is equal to, remember double equals here, false. So the purchase price was over $5,000 and it wasn't expected. I'm going to print potential fraud. If it wasn't either of those, so else, I'm going to print seems legit. Okay, going to run that. As you can see, this was not over $5,000, not over 5,000, not over 5,000. Okay, this third one was. So I'm going to, or sorry, the fourth one. So I'm going to look at the fourth one. The fourth one was over 5,000 and it was not expected. So that should be highlighted as potential fraud. If I look at another one, like this $23,000, that is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the sixth. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so $23,000 purchase, but it was expected, which means it should not highlight as fraud, and it doesn't. It's down here as the seems legit. But there is one final one that is $7,000 and was not expected, and so that will be highlighted as potential fraud. So again, just ways of doing more complex logic within the for loops, and it lets you do it very fast and very frequently. So with that, I'm going to stop. That's all I have for loops. Again, this is pretty much the most fundamental thing to Python, and it's really what sets it apart from just any sort of simple calculator or anything that you can write, is this ability to do lots of comparisons and to do them over and over again using loops. So stay tuned for the next video. Keep up with this Python Bootcamp, and I will see you next time.